move on to a different subject.
Right.
State. So.
Well, Roy, back over to you if you've got another piece of news. I'm holding back
have,
my features.
It's kind of interesting because we talk about Android as the main. That's the new identity of Linux in a way. And, I don't exactly like that because I call it the. Actually, in the case of Android, what you have is Linux plus lockdown, or kind of DRM and shops and even Google is set to have leaked to the next interface of the next thing, and that's kind of hold on a second. That's an open source project. It's not supposed to be leaked. It's supposed to be negotiated, and people are supposed to know about it as it goes along. There is no leak in open source projects. But I'm kind of concerned. Even Chrome OS, it's kind of like a new plus Linux plus lockdown, and because they do all kinds of things with the operating system. Trying to sell it under the proposition of, this is going to be easier for you. We give you shackles to be secure, and we make the root partition read only just because we want to make sure that you don't mess with it. But they don't exactly help, and I'm not a big fan of that. But Android is becoming it's basically doing to Linux what Linux once did to GNU. It's kind of replacing it as an identity and as a product. So people will just say, oh, what is this Linux thing? I have a phone running Android and it's got this robot in it. What's this penguin thing? And it's the same thing that happened with Linux when GNU had been working since 1983 or so, and in 1991 or in 95, you had people actually using Linux on some desktops. And they would just ask, what is this bull thing? What is this? Is GNU? What is it about? Or a guy with a beard? What has he done? He's not this Finnish guy who invented Linux. And that's the way they would approach that. So lots of people think that's the Google OS, that's the Android, created by Google because they're so magical. And this is what we have to deal with, as this is the future of, as far as I know, mobile Linux, because I'm not sure Migo is going to be capable of catching up in terms of market share and momentum.
You see, this is where I think myself and you have slightly different views, Roy, because I'm certainly all for an Android brand, if you like, and I'm all for branding. I think that Microsoft, and it goes without saying, obviously the desktop is a battleground of sorts between Linux and Windows and the Mac, and I think that in order to compete or to be able to try and compete, I think Linux needs to have a brand identity. I think Linux needs to be seen with the same eyes that people view Windows as a sustainable, as a product, as something marketable, as something with a certain value. Because I think if you leave an operating system or have a distro which is too free to everybody, I think that puts the mainstream user off. And at the end of the day, I think we've got, there's a hardcore group of people who are into their technology, who understand these concepts, but for the vast majority of people who use their machines every day and surf the net and do their Facebook or whatever it is they do, these sort of issues they don't consider, and to them it is about brand, and to them it is about logos and symbols and flashy little icons, that represent whatever particular product they're using. And I think maybe why Linux has had such an issue gaining market share is because it hasn't established itself as a brand.
You're doing okay, actually. It just depends if you're... Android is not doing much on the desktop so far. It's actually approaching the very same markets that Nokia could have done pretty well in.
But I mean, if you look at Android, Android has a branding, it has its little green robot, and it's competing very well against Apple. But I think without that branding and without having a unique identity,
I don't agree with you. I don't exactly. If you look back at 2006 and 2007, I wrote and I posted and I came like lots of articles that saying Linux is the future of mobile, and these articles were quite right about 2010, 12, whatever. Linux is the leading platform because it's more economic to work under cooperation, with lots of cooperation working at least with the kernel in this way, and many companies were moving towards that. It's just that Android was the one gaining the most momentum, and that's the one that's leading the way right now as the so-called Linux choice. It doesn't have an GNU in it. It doesn't really have much of a... I'm not complaining about Android. I'm posting lots of news about it. But I'm just saying I prefer Migo to play... I prefer to basically have diversity in the Linux space. Android to a certain extent killed what used to be called Lips, which was then merged into Limo, and Limo died as well. And you have all kinds of other things which probably you won't remember now, including the POM options and all kinds of things which weren't competitive and were killed even before you had products out running these platforms. And you have lots of dead code in these. So you had lots of different mobile platforms since 2007. You had Orange working with Access, and you had I can think of a Japanese one. There is another Japanese one, and they never, maybe you saw prototypes of these things, but Android is basically gaining on behalf of Linux at the expense of these other platforms, which would have been just fine. And I would like to see at least Nokia or somebody giving the Linux side of things a bit more of a challenge, a bit like having Ubuntu and Fedora competing, and Ubuntu and Debian and things like that.
Yes, I mean, my view would be, on the desktop, the fact that we've got hundreds of different distributions is great. It does give you a lot of scope and a lot of choice and a lot of freedom. I think my personal view is certainly for the mobile phone, things are a lot different. I personally don't think your average mobile phone user particularly cares or particularly would want a plethora of options of operating systems or platforms for their phone. I think Android has stepped up to the mark with its name. It's given Linux, if you like, a new identity of sorts on the mobile, and that is the one that the mainstream populace are flooding to. You just have to look at obviously the figures.
Yeah, the question is, this is where we obviously have different opinions, but I think the reason myself and lots of people actually do promote and have promoted Linux since the early days is because they were seeing it as something inherently different, not so much of a brand, but more of a different way of collaborating and to view source code and participate and also standing behind something that's not centralized in the company. I think of it as Mozilla, the Mozilla Foundation. The reason I like Firefox is because I know at the end of the day, nobody is becoming extremely powerful out of this corporation. Nobody is becoming this sort of, Steve Jobs messiah, everyone listen to his advice. And that's important because if you give a person too much power, usually it will be misused. In the case of Mozilla, they don't get extremely rich. They'll get wages, they work in a good browser. They don't try to lump all kinds of programs into you and basically push you into the so-called Mozilla search engine and the Mozilla email service. And in the case of Ubuntu now, you have this thing called Ubuntu One, and they try to put you on Amazon. But with Mozilla, they're very focused on specific, mostly on Firefox, especially now that Thunderbird has been kind of demoted or isn't being treated as equal since 2008. They very much focus on just delivering a good browser, which they do, and you know that they are there to ask you how much you like their browser, and they show you the designs, and they allow you to also fork, and you have lots of forks of Firefox. You don't really have forks of Linux, but you have branches and all kinds of people having patch sets for Linux. But that's just the point where Linux is still flexible. Now, how many ports or changes or hacks do you know for Android? I know there is one in China, and I know there is one which is supposed to offer an open option of Android. I don't think of Android as open. It's very basically developed internally in Google, and they just kind of dump the code out and say, well, here's the code at the end. And yes, you can compile the code and you can get the nightly, but I don't think they involve too many companies in this thing which is called Open Handset Alliance. That's been criticized by some of its own members who thought, we will participate in developing this thing. And the most involvement from the outside you get so far is the carriers trying to customize things, or the companies like Samsung and LG and HTC trying to put the changes which define the uniqueness of their devices. That's the open part of it.
That's for me. That's where the balance comes in. It's same with like grey box PC vendors as well, laptop vendors and netbooks, and tablets, and same with smartphones. You've got the companies behind them want to, on one hand, they want to show something as being uniquely theirs. On the other hand, if they do it completely unique, in other words, create their own distribution, or even create their own operating system, don't even use Linux or BSD as a base, just build their own thing from scratch. That ramps up the development costs, it ramps up the maintenance costs,